Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 6 from the 2018 World Chess Championship match. The current champion Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces in this one against challenger Fabiano Caruana. Players are level, entering Game 6, 2.5 points apiece in this race to 6.5. Each player still in search of their first win. Little room for error in this match, I'd say, at this stage, halfway point, call it. How long will they be able to continue to play at this super top level, engine-like? Well, this game here, memorable to say the least. There's a lot to it. Right out of the opening, it grabs our attention. Middle game, rich with ideas, and an endgame is one that left plenty of top-level grandmasters scratching their heads, even with the assistance of an engine. So, in Game 2, Carlsen had white, tried d4. Game 4, c4. This time around, trying to hit Caruana from all different angles, tests the waters with e4. It was bound to happen. What do I mean? The Petrov's defense is on board. This is Caruana's favorite reply to e4, and it is now on board. Move 4 is one that I'm sure turned many heads. Now, the most popular move is to drop back to f3. That move in the database that I looked at had nearly 14,000 moves, 14,000 games. There's also a crazy gambit with knight takes f7, over 100 moves. None of the above. In this game, it's knight d3. 19 games in the database I looked at. Not so common to do a move like this, obstruct your center pawn. The d pawn would like to move. Okay, the knight's going to get out of its way soon enough. Let's see how play follows. Black regains the material, queens compete on the only open file, and now, get ready for this, we have a series of 10 consecutive knight moves. Is this some record? This isn't what makes the game special. This is just kind of our appetizer for this game. Yeah, a lot of knight moves early on. Kicking off with knight f4, knight c6. Did I really mean this? 10 consecutive knight moves. Queen is under fire. I did mean that. Black ignores the threat and says, I'm going to hit your queen back. Queens are gone after just 8. Queenless middle game position. This is not an endgame. Still a lot of traffic on board. Queen and a pawn are the only ones watching from the sidelines. Both knights are saved, each throwing a punch. Both of these points are now defended. Knight a3, knight e6. Okay. From here, this knight is in white's house. It's given a shove. There's a couple ways you could do that. d3 or f3. Why f3? Well, this pawn really wants to play into d4. White's going to squeeze a little bit more out of this pawn. f3, additionally, creates a nice pocket for the white king. White at this point is already eyeing up the f2 square for the king instead of castles, so that the king is a tiny bit closer to the center. From here, knight c5, not too many options. d4 immediately does not need prep work. Knight takes pawn. Well, that knight has a responsibility. There would follow a fork. d4 is poison. Knight d7. Black is now threatening to give the knight a kick, and then, once there's no pressure on c7, win the d4 pawn. So d4 is secure with a pawn. Also, a new square is available for this knight on the edge. Knight's given a kick, knight f4, knight b6, bishop d3, so just getting some pieces out, repositioning for white. Bishop d6. This tension has remained for some time. Neither side really wants to initiate the exchange because the other side can recapture and improve a piece. Right? Knight takes on f4, bishop recaptures, but at this stage, after bishop d6, something needs to be done. Only at this point do we have a capture, so one knight is gone. Follow up, king to f2. Now from here, black is looking to grab some space on the king side. And this idea to play h4 is pretty serious, should be addressed. It is. White plays h4 himself. Now, why do I say that establishing a pawn on h4 is serious? Well, if you just play bishop to d2, let's say, this pawn, this bishop, coordination on g3 makes life difficult for the rook, right? If the rook tries to contribute, drops h2, and, well, before you could activate the rook, it seems like you have to do this, but you would then give up a big square. It's important to not allow this pawn to coordinate with the bishop in short. So it stopped cold. h4 on board. A RAM structure on the H file as well as on the D file. Now, when h4 is played, it does create a gap. This is a hole. At the moment, it doesn't appear like black can take advantage of it, but he's taking a step in the direction of exploiting g3 with his next move. It's a long way off. The knight is out here in left field, but with knight c8, he has an idea to coordinate well with the bishop. If the bishop gets there, you take away a nice pivot square on this only open file. Okay, we're still a long ways off. White can combat that plan in many different ways. During the game, I questioned knight a4. How great of an inconvenience would the knight on a4 be? Typically, when it's on the edge, it's not doing so much, but it could be problematic in some cases, a knight on a4, putting pressure on b2, c3 structure. A simple way out is to start with rook b1. That's the only inconvenient move white would have to make. Bishop d2 would happen naturally. It's developing and defending c3. So just putting a move on like king d7. White would play here, and finally, the knight will be given a boot back to b6. So really, this would not be a great bother. Maybe something Caruana considered, but in the end decided on repositioning the knight. He is eyeing up the not d7. He's eyeing up the f5 square. So here we go. Knight e3, knight e7. And this is an important moment in the game. It seems kind of quiet, but there's an idea that black has in mind after knight to e7 that needs to be addressed. What is this idea? Well, first of all, let me just note something about the knights. At the moment, the white knight stands better than the black knight. It's a third-ranked knight versus a second-ranked knight, but that can soon change. It can change in a blink. And what do I mean? Well, the knight can be given a shove, can be demoted by a rank if white is not careful, and black on his next move with the knight can promote the knight by 2 ranks. What am I talking about? Well, let's just say the move d2, bishop d2 is played. Black has this option to launch the f-pawn. It creates a lot of gaps in black's camp, but the plan here with f5 is to go one step further with f4. Kick the knight back, and then make use of the f5 square with the knight. So let me show what I'm talking about. First here to secure some pieces against any tactics. And if white doesn't do anything, let's just say b3, this starts to be annoying for white, right? The knight that once stood better than the knight on e7 is demoted, and this knight is promoted. Look at how quickly things can change with a slight change in the structure. This is a big deal. White takes a step to address the f5 move on move 21. Playing g3, basically in a blink, is well aware of this plan and is now in a position to meet f5 with knight g2. This is basically a winning position for white. It's strategically busted for black. These weaknesses on f4 and g5 will soon be pounced on with the white pieces, and this bishop suffers. It's a tall pawn, basically, on e6. Now, One other note is that instead of g3, bishop d2, f5, and then g3, black can break down the king position with f4. And you really don't want to enter this position as white, allow that kind of pawn break. Keep in mind, white has made a big decision when playing king to f2. This is his shelter. He wants to stay close to the center. If this shelter can be broken down, there's still a lot of pieces on board. Things can open up. Maybe the king is going to be vulnerable. Okay, in this game, g3, anticipating f5. From here, c5, with in mind, the king positions, basically. c5, a lot of time spent on that move. Nearly 20 minutes on the c5 advance. What is black trying to do? Black is trying to demonstrate that the king positions, white's king position is a liability. Trying to open lines on the other wing to maybe one day have a c-file open up and subject the king to some, second rank pressure. This captures white's attention. Black has not yet committed the king. At some point can tuck it away. Castle kingside, and things can get really scary fast for white if not careful. The center at the moment is maybe close to collapsing. Let's see how white addresses this pressure on d4 first of all. Repositions the bishop, eyeing up b3, clearing the way for the rook to have some support of d4. Black finally, on this move 22, commits. At the moment, there's a pretty big difference on the clocks. From here, rook to d1, rook f to d8, knight g2. At this moment, there's a capture on d4. Now, you can't recapture with the rook and try to play against what would be an isolated pawn, because we see highlighted this poor king position. This is one way black can get at white, show that this is a vulnerable post. Another thing to note is if in this position white is capturing on c5 instead of playing knight g2, this is inviting a piece forward, and black will soon be able to eliminate this isolated pawn, and things get cracked open in the center. There's still a lot of pieces around that can cause the white king a headache. Bear that in mind. This is one of the deeper points that sparks a c5 advance. Also, a strategy, with that in mind, a strategy for white would be, let's simplify the position a little bit so my king is not vulnerable, and when I move towards the center, I'm going to be closer towards the center if it becomes a bit simplified. And your king, the black king, is way out there. It's going to take a lot more tempi before your king gets involved. So black keep things complicated. White's looking to really simplify right about this point. So repositioning, knight g2, almost there to have the bishop secure d4. Black takes right now. Got to recapture with the pawn. Rook a to c8, bishop b3, strong piece on b3. Couple things in mind, pressure on d5, some security against a rook invasion. A best piece for white? I think so. Caruana recognizes this and says, I'm going to challenge that piece. Knight a5 nearby. Not only that, not only threatening to take the bishop, but knight c4 is also interesting. So from here, about 10 minutes spent on bishop to f4. Ideally, you would like a dark square bishop if you're playing as white. This is the bad guy, this is a good guy. Well, I should highlight it like this. These are the two bad bishops, having a look at these fixed pawns in the center. A desirable exchange, dark square bishops, and white would like to put a knight on one of these dark squares. Maybe have a good knight on e3 versus a bad bishop on e6. So what does black do? Keeps this tension. eyes up a knight takes bishop or knight c4. From here, rook d to c1. I believe one of the thoughts behind this particular rook move instead of rook a to c1 is that if black chooses to capture the bishop and double the b pawns, black will at some point have to address the threat on a7. So we don't have knight takes bishop, but rather a bishop to b4, avoiding this good for bad bishop exchange. Black maintains the bishops with bishop to b4, maintains the good bishop. White similarly preserves the light square bishop. This is white's good bishop. And now the knight jumps into c4. If we don't have bishop to b4 and the knight takes here, it's considered an evenish position. How might play continue? Something like this. The computer says still duck this exchange. Even if you allow the rook activity, the bishop will have a really good post on b6. Black playing with the bishop pair. Maybe down a pawn, but there is certainly compensation. Open position, bishop pair. Okay. Bishop b4 straight away. No knight takes b4. Black has a different idea with the knight. Let's see what that is. Knight c4. b2 under fire. How do you address that? Knight's given a kick. Now this creates a gap on a3. There's some interesting choices at this stage. Knight a3, knight d6. I believe you could even consider knight to b2. Only if you could get to d3, and it appears you can get to d3. Knight a3 is played in this game. One of the top suggestions. The knight is eyeing up the d4 pawn at this point. Knight b5 nearby. d4, keep in mind, is currently unprotected and soon to be a focal point for the black pieces. From here, pair of rooks exchanged, rook c1, knight b5, both rooks are gone. This is not some dead drawn position because the rooks have been exchanged. There is still a lot going on. First of all, how exactly does white defend d4? So, for example, bishop to e3, the move played in the game is knight to e3, but if you're playing bishop to e3, knight c3 can be problematic, right? Hitting the bishop, hitting a pawn. There's some problems white has to solve here. Plays knight e3, goes on the offensive, says, you take my pawn? I'm going to take your pawn. We'll just exchange the d pawns. What does black do? Well, it's not so quick to give up the d pawn. This is a super knight. Defense, attack on the bishop, attack on the pawn. What black wants is to defend e6 and then knock out the a2 pawn, just win a pawn. So white has to be creative. Goes into a bit of a think soon. First, bishop c2, bishop a3, ensuring that this pawn does not bolt. Okay, just puts a stop to any pawn move. Wants to keep that guy on a2. Bishop to b8, a6, and now f4. So this was a very creative approach by Carlsen. This f-pawn is racing up to challenge the bishop if it wants to defend here, and make life a little bit difficult as well to defend the h5 pawn. This cost a lot of time, right? These last handful of moves, he spent about 15 minutes on bishop to b8. This idea to move the bishop, play f4, this is what we have on board. And after bishop d7, looking to defend the pawn like this, and then take the pawn, we have f5, bishop c6, and bishop to d1. This was a really cool sequence, kicking off with bishop to b8. moving the pawn to f4, f5, and now knowing that you have this retreat, it is defended, and some pressure against h5. There isn't a great way to defend here, so you have to look to hit black in a different way. Direct defensive a2 is not there. White goes on the offensive, pinpointing h5. We're approaching move 40, the first time control of this game where players gain 50 minutes. What do we have from here? Bishop b2 is on board. Now, from here we have bishop takes h5. Instead of bishop to b2, suppose black tries to hang on to h5. This can backfire on black. An approach, if black tries to defend h5, is a capture, reposition back to c2, and now, if the knight takes on a2, this pawn would fall. If black defends first with king f7, we have this reposition. Again, a2 can fall, but this is a way forward for white. Take the a pawn, well, both your kingside pawns may soon fall. This is a way white can proceed, go on the offensive, maybe retain the material, or restore the material. In this game, it is not g6. Black gives up the h-pawn and instead focuses on this valuable center pawn. Bishop takes h5, move 40, knight e4 check. Another path is to take on a2. That's super interesting too. That would create a 2-to-1 majority on the queen side. White, on the other hand, after this last capture on h5, has a 3-to-2 majority on the king side. Caruana picks knight e4, a nice central post for the knight, king g2, and now picks up d4. Immediately, d5 becomes passed. The bishops start to look super menacing for white. Adjacent diagonals. The bishop that was once staring at that pawn, the pawn on d5, well, it's now mobile. Bishop's ready to move, pawn is ready to advance, and knight is then ready to move with a discovered check. White needs to be a bit careful about this idea. Let's see the approach. First, repositions the bishop. Now, black, again, earlier I was pointing out, if it becomes a bit too simplified, white can easily, in a snap, just become better, maybe winning. I want to highlight that. For example, if, let's say, the bishop backs up, and we have bishop f3, these are the moves played in the game, so let's keep these right here. If in this position, black played the move d4. This is not a good decision. Here's one way white could look to get some exchanges in. So let's just say black continues to push or something. How can white simplify? Knight d2 will force some exchanges. I'm not saying this is the best reply for black. I'm going through this variation to show you how a simplified position, one where it is just two bishops like this, is a win for white immediately. The king will feel comfortable moving towards the center, gladly pick up the pawn, and go on to earn the full point. Black needs to be careful. You do not want to simplify like this. So what is the reply to bishop f3, a move that is helping secure the white king along this diagonal? Caruana hits at a top move, and we go to a very interesting endgame. Knight d2 is that move, basically forcing the following. Bishop takes on d5. Taking with the knight first would immediately lose because of knight takes bishop and bishop takes knight next. So it is first bishop takes d5, bishop takes knight. No bishop takes bishop here because of a bishop takes bishop check. and there's no time to take the knight. So we go down this path, one where we have a very interesting imbalance. What is that exactly? Well, there are two imbalances in this endgame. Opposite color bishops, and also 3 pawns versus the knight, who is close to being trapped if black isn't careful. During the game, I was thinking, at this point you play bishop a3. But if bishop a3 to stop this passed pawn from even thinking about running, white could play bishop d3 and ask the knight, what are you going to do? Where's your next move? All light squares are taken away from this guy if bishop d3 is in. There's a better way forward for black. Black improves the knight first. Make sure he's not going to get stuck on d2. And throws a punch. White has to address that. So only after g4, only after the knight is rescued, safe on e4, does black play bishop a3. This seems to be a favorite square of the bishop, revisiting it now on this move 48. It was already there on move 35. Similar point behind bishop a3 in this case. Don't allow this pawn to move. This knight is ready to hunt it once more. So, what does white do? First, gets the bishop on a better square, opposite the king. Maybe at some stage you can take advantage of the pinned pawn. Black says, I want none of it. I'm getting out of the line of fire. g5, knight c3, and now an instructive moment in this endgame. Do you give up the a pawn? No. White says, I would much rather you take the b pawn. Now, why is it better, and this is what we have, bishop takes pawn in this position, why is it better to maintain the a pawn than the b pawn in this endgame? Well, the knight, it's known, absolutely hates defending against rook pawns. Doesn't like to be on the edge. It's more likely to have to be near the edge in order to prevent this rook pawn from advancing. White is better off with an outside passed pawn. So, the a pawn is still alive. White improves the king. Some repositioning with the black knight. The goal here, well, first of all, black is the side trying for something here. Now it is only with black picking up the b pawn. White only has 2 pawns for the knight in this endgame. And the plan here for black is to make sure white doesn't exchange both of these pawns. Black needs to get to some position where one of these two, the f pawn or g pawn, are still around. So for example, a bad idea for black would be to play g6, because one pawn is exchanged, and soon enough, the other will be exchanged. Therefore, black maintains a pawn on f6. King g4. This is a new square that's available. Now with f6 in, the king is eyeing that up. From here, knight e4. King h5. And how do you prevent this king g6 move? King f7 doesn't do it. He'll be kicked immediately. The idea behind king g6 is to put pressure on f6. Give the knight a kick and then capture away on f6. If black is doing something like this at this move 56, that's no good either. Because eventually, even if it costs a pawn, white will be able to eliminate black's remaining pawn. Black won't be able to do something like this. The bishop will hunt it down one way. Not like that. One way or the other, by way of d3 or e8. So having a pawn on a light square, that guy will track it down. So what is the plan at this stage? Well, not to capture on g5, but rather play bishop to e1. Aha. So now, after king g6, or if king g6 is played, there would be bishop takes pawn. So what does white do? First, gives the knight a kick, knight d6. And, well, the king really wants to be on g6, but in order to play that, he needs to distract the bishop. This is what Carlsen goes for. Says, go a pawn. This distracts the bishop, releases pressure on h4, in other words. And now we have a capture on f6, and the king could step up to the g6 square. There is no bishop takes h4 here. Move 60 is where we stand. So from here, defensive f6, king h7, white is putting pieces on light squares, pawn on h5. The plan here for white is not to just keep advancing like this. In fact, if you go too far, there are some cool mating nets that can happen. I'll try to highlight one of them. From this position, bishop d2. Moving the pawn right now will easily be tracked down. So on this move, 65, bishop a2 was played. If h6, this is how black can follow. Knight g4, king here, you take with the bishop. Knight still has to defend here. And if white tries this kind of stuff, attacking two minors, the way out is to go here. You take my bishop, I take your bishop, and I go on to win. You save your bishop, and I save my bishop, playing bishop to g5. So, in short, not good to put this pawn on a dark square. These two will track it down. So, in this game, it's bishop to a2. Let's also just point out this little mating net I'm referring to. Again, this kind of move would track the pawn down, but I'm going to make a dummy move to show you trying to advance like this as white is really foolish. You're one step away from queening, right? Well, now your king has no moves. Checkmate. Next move. So you don't want to just race the pawn all the way up there. This is as far as this pawn should go in this current position. So move 65, the bishop just gets as far away as possible from the king so that this knight doesn't land any crazy fork. From here, knight f3, bishop d5, knight d4, king g6, bishop to g5, and bishop to c4. This moment right here is the big one in this endgame. Black has a winning continuation, but it's nearly impossible to figure it out. It's study-like. It's one of those study-like endings. Well, I'm going to throw it as a pop quiz to you if you'd like to try and figure this one out, if you'd like. What is at least the first move that gets us in the direction of winning here? Black to move, what would you do? Okay. Yeah, this one's a tough one to crack, to be sure. The star move in this position is bishop to h4. Now, why? This is where I'm going to share I'm just going to scratch the surface with this endgame by sharing a couple cool variations. First of all, what would black do if white just continues to march with the pawn? So, suppose bishop h4 was the move played. How would black reply if h6? Well, first we have knight f3. And it seems like this pawn can't be stopped, right? Well, it can, with these timely moves, knight e5 check. If king here, black would give a check, force the king away from g7, and the king is there to stop the pawn and next win the pawn. You could only hang on to the pawn for a short while. If this position is on board, you could defend, but then we have this kind of stuff. Eventually, Black is forcing the bishop to move. Otherwise, we simplify into a bishop and pawn versus a pawn position, so the bishop would have to move. Black picks up the pawn and goes about the win something like this, just to give you a sense of how you can eventually track down the pawn. Once the h-pawn falls, the king and the knight simply converge on the remaining pawn, and black goes on to win. So, again, bishop h4, star move. We're not done yet with these variations. h6. Knight f3 would be the follow-up. Here, check. We already saw what would happen if the king goes here. There's a bishop g5 move. If the king goes to h5, hitting the bishop, well, black could play king g7. We had a similar situation before. King takes bishop, knight takes bishop. And if this bishop is rescued, this bishop is rescued. Soon enough, the h-pawn will be hunted if, in this position, white continues to push the pawn. Another variation, and probably the most difficult one black would have to calculate, is the following. After bishop h4 and let's say bishop d5, stopping a knight f3 move, here's the winning sequence. Bishop f3, black would have to have spotted this move. You ready? This is the star move. Knight g1. Now, what makes this move here so special? Well, it's going to be trapped, it appears. Knight is on the edge. Dark square, light square bishop can trap it. Bishop g4. What would black do here? How do you make progress as black? This is the winning continuation. I'm not going to carry it out until checkmate. I'm just going to carry it out until a point where black is able to finally win the h-pawn, and we know what to do from there. So what's the winning continuation? How do we get to the point where this pawn falls? It's king g8. And, well, what does white do? Keep in mind, any bishop move allows knight h3 into f4. So let me put that on first. After king g8, we can have knight h3 and knight f4. This would actually be a cool way to forget about winning the pawn. That's another instance of checkmate. Knight f4 is pretty powerful. And so let's just say white stays here with the bishop and moves the king. What is the way forward? Well, we have this little ring around the rosy with the bishop. Let's see this cool sequence. Bishop g3, king g6, bishop e5, king h6, check, and at the end of these moves, bishop g3, e5, f4, and now g5, black has to do what? Move the bishop and give up this square? Or move the pawn? The king has no moves. White would have to play h6. Black can now go to the corner. And after h7, we repeat this same sequence with the bishop. Bishop h4, bishop g3, e5, f4, g5. Once more, black has to concede something. A king move, the pawn falls. A bishop move, the pawn will soon fall. Knight f4, and the king will be flushed away from this pawn. That's a lot to figure out, I'd say. And this is one of the variations that needed to be calculated. This is what had so many top-level grandmasters kind of scratching their head with this endgame. There was a forced win kicking off with this absolutely sparkling bishop to h4 move. Move 68, the move of the match thus far. It was not played. This was a win for black. Can we say a missed win? I don't know. This is super difficult. It was there, though. Cool ending, study-like ending. In this game, knight f3 on board. King h7, knight e5. Let's see what black tries in this endgame. We have eventually the knight and bishop. This construction is gluing, freezing the white pawns, and now the black king is going to try to go behind enemy lines and somehow coordinate on these pawns. It's difficult to do that, however. So in this position, black on move played knight e3. If instead the king comes over like this, the bishop is always there, prepared to take the knight out like this, and then push the pawn. The idea being to meet bishop takes pawn with not that, but this, which is a draw. So in the game, what does black play? Knight e3. White pushes, and after bishop takes pawn, a draw offer was made and it was accepted. There are a couple approaches here for white. You get to take your pick. Taking the bishop is a draw. Taking the pawn is a draw. Yeah, this is a drawn ending. Opposite colored bishops. Opponent has an extra knight. That's a draw. And this one here is also a pretty simple draw to hold. The main focus should be to maintain the bishop on this diagonal and always be in a position to sacrifice the bishop for the pawn. We didn't get to that point. This is as far as we went in this one. Bishop h6. A draw agreed. Big time game. Again, I was only, I believe, scratching the surface with the variations I showed at the end there. The one that sparkled is knight to g1, putting the knight in a trap like that and knowing that eventually you can exhaust all tempi by white and eventually pick up the h-pawn. That's pretty wild. We remain level in this game. 3 points apiece now going into game 7. It remains deadlocked. As always, feel free, as usual, to leave any feedback to this video in the comment section below. But wait a second, I forgot one thing. The tail of the tape. I almost forgot. Yeah, 2 engines, basically. Still the same story. A moment for Caruana in this endgame. There should probably be an even bigger spike right around here, but it does give us some sense that there was something missed at that move 68. Final tally on this one, an inaccuracy apiece, 6-6 on the average centi-pawn loss. Okay, I think that's now all I wanted to share with this one. Again, as usual, feel free to leave any feedback to this video in the comment section below. And as always, I hope you got something out of this one. That's all for now. Take care.